Hey, this is Tom Webster, and this is Sounds Profitable for Tuesday, April 11th, 2023. How to Murder a Podcast. This week, I spot a misapplication of podcast research that I felt strongly enough to hopefully nip in the bud, wherever the bud may be found. But first, London's calling. The Sounds Profitable Business Leader Summit is coming to the podcast show in London. Partners of Sounds Profitable are invited to join us on Tuesday, May 23rd. Podcast show passes are not required for attendance, but you do have to be a partner. For more information, get in touch with us via the link in the show notes or at soundsprofitable.com. Edison Research put out one of their weekly insights posts last week with some data pulled from Edison Podcast Metrics, or EPM. The article was about the batting average of various genres in podcasting. And whatever the intent of this post, the headline, Want to Hit Podcast, Swing for the Fences with True Crime, and how it's subsequently been reported. I saw it in one trade publication. True Crime is the most likely to be a hit podcast. I think all of that has the potential to lead podcasters astray. And this, dear listeners, is a thing I do not want. So this week, I thought I'd break this data down a little bit and provide some context that will hopefully lead you to better decisions, which is part of our mission here at Sounds Profitable. The core of this insight was an analysis of the number of podcasts in each genre that cracked the top 200 shows in EPM, divided by the total number of shows in each genre that are tracked by EPM. And the quotient of this simple math was something that Edison calls the batting average for each genre, which is expressed as the percentage of shows tracked per genre that make that top 200 podcast list. The results of this analysis showed that 3.8% of the true crime podcasts tracked by EPM made the top 200. That's a full percentage point higher than the genre with the second best batting average, comedy. Now, here's what I think is undeniably true based on this data. As far as EPM is concerned, true crime podcasts do indeed punch above their weight class. That the genre is popular is not something you need a calculator for. Edison's data shows that it's third in terms of total shows in the top 200, and true crime as a genre overall has reliably been in the top 5 in podcasting since EPM began in 2019. It's especially strong with women. In our own most recent study, or actually our Q4 study from 2022, Safe and Sound, we showed it Sounds Profitable that it was the number 3 genre overall, but also number 1 with women. Starting a true crime podcast, as the data suggests, is probably a pretty good idea given how popular the genre is. Now, I don't have an issue with anyone looking at this data and telling themselves, wow, true crime is really popular. That data is reliable and stable quarter to quarter. I do have an issue with making the leap from that to saying that true crime is the most likely genre to succeed, a supposition I find fairly dangerous and unsupported by the design of the EPM research. The other side of making that leap is looking at the shows with the lowest batting average and seeing that as a disincentive to produce content in those genres. TV and film, for instance, is represented as having a batting average of 0.2%, or about 20 times worse than that of true crime. So much for my Night Agent fan podcast. And it's here that, as a recovering former fantasy baseball addict, I think it's worth saying a word or two about batting average. This won't take long, non-sports fans. The highest batting average in Major League Baseball history belongs to Tyrus Raymond Cobb, who finished his career at a cool 366. That's like 100 times more successful than true crime. He murdered that ball. Cobb maintained that average over a total of over 13,000 plate appearances. And last week, on April Fool's Day, Milwaukee's Joey Wiemer made his major league debut, hitting .500 against the Chicago Cubs. Now, Wiemer may end up being a quality baseball player for many years, but no one would suggest that his .500 average, he was at bat 2 times, is better than Cobb's 366, because his sample size is minuscule compared to what Cobb did. To truly understand the import of a batting average, it isn't enough to know the average. You have to know the number of successes and the number of failures. It's the size of the total universe. Now, EPM doesn't give you this directly, but it's all there for you to calculate, should you so choose. And I did. At the top of Edison's batting average graph, True Crime bats 038, or 3.8%, placing 27 shows in the top 200. My handy-dandy abacus tells me that means EPM tracks about 700 true crime shows. Now, for comparison, Apple Podcasts indexes about 2.5 million shows, and Podcast Index at podcastindex.org clears over 4 million. So 700 is not a lot. In the grand scale of the totality of the podcasting space, extrapolating podcast behavior, not human behavior, from podcast behavior, from a small sample of the most extreme outliers, would be like a batting coach telling you to do whatever Joey Weimer does because he went 1 for 2 on his debut. To put this into podcasting terms, deducing that My Favorite Murder and Crime Junkies are very good podcasts because they're reliably in the top 5 or 10 shows in EPM is a solid deduction. But extrapolating that to a statement like true crime shows are more likely to succeed is putting a lot of your season on Joey Weimer. Like Soylent Green, it's people. It's worth talking about here what well-constructed consumer surveys like EPM are good at measuring and what they're not designed to measure. The sample universe of survey research is people, weekly podcast listeners in the case of EPM. They're very good at this because they typically use a large sample of listeners, and also, this is important, because they draw from the entire universe of listeners, old and young, recent converts and veterans, podcast junkies and Rogan-onlys, all alike. Because surveys like EPM sample from the entire pool of listeners, every time you drop a claw into the Chuck E. Cheese magical stuffed animal claw game, you get a beast that looks roughly the same every time. That's the magic of proper survey research, and done correctly, it works 90% of the time, every time, and that is significantly better than Sex Panther. And that's why I tend to look at any measure that comes out of EPM regarding the behavior of humans as credible. I've been under the hood with this data for years, and I know it doesn't jump around a lot from quarter to quarter. It's stable and reliable. So when EPM tells you that X% of podcast listeners enjoy true crime, I treat that as about as good an estimate as you're going to get. I mean, I did help design EPM and worked on it for years with the current team to hone the product and make it as accurate and reliable as possible. I believe that what it was designed to do, measure humans, it does and continues to do very well. Here's what it doesn't measure. Podcasts. This is a not-so-subtle distinction that I want to cement in your minds when you think about any form of research data. Now, the study is completely transparent about this. It's right there below the graph that Edison printed. The batting average is the number of shows in each genre that make the top 200 divided by the number of shows in that genre that they track, which is about 20,000. These aren't arbitrary numbers. They are the limits of the EPM dataset because EPM doesn't measure podcasts. It measures people. And the most popular podcasts, according to what those people say they listen to. This makes it very good at the current sample size at telling you a fair amount about the top 200 podcasts. And those are fairly stable. But it tells you very little about podcasts 201 to 20,000 in popularity. And it tells you absolutely nothing about podcasts 20,001 to 4,041,596, which represents 99.99% of available podcasts. And yes, I did do the math. This means that the great Chuck E. Cheese claw machine of this survey only grabs shows that are reliably in the top 0.01% of shows. To say that these shows are outliers is a whopper of an understatement, given the decidedly non-normal distribution of podcast listening. The individual shows that make up the top 200 or even 20,000 look nothing like the shows in the rest of the podcast universe, in the way that Giannis Antetokounmpo looks like no one in my neighborhood pickup game. So here's why I made this into a whole thing. Let's get back to why this got me exercised in the first place. And it wasn't to cast EPM in any kind of disparaging light. Again, I helped to build it, and I know what it's really good at. I want you to make better decisions with your podcasts. If you look at this batting average list and intuit without guidance that it's useless for you to make a podcast about 1980s TV sitcoms because the batting average for that genre is so low, then this list has done you and ALF fans everywhere a tremendous disservice. So I want you to remember 3 key things the next time you see data like this. Number 1, past performance is not predictive, especially in an immature market. This is especially true in podcasting, a medium that fully 2/3 of the country has not made a part of their weekly media diet. When you look at that part of the country, you know it has a heck of a lot better batting average than true crime? Fictional crime. Anything that ends in and order, CIS, CSI, or starts with Chicago is a heck of a lot more successful than nearly any podcast you can think of. What got podcasting here won't get us there. And what has or hasn't been successful to date is less relevant to future success than you might think. Ask anyone who bought crypto a year ago. Number 2, there is room for your podcast, regardless of genre. Making existential decisions about the genre of your podcast based on the current universe relies on a scarcity mentality, one that assumes we are at peak podcasting and that gaming the system or other forms of arbitrage are a necessary part of the success equation. Nothing could be further from the truth. Now, for more on that, you should read what my friend Eric Newsom had to say about the myth of market saturation in podcasting. He talked about this at Radio Days Europe, where I saw him, and also wrote about this in his newsletter. We'll link to it in the show notes. And I don't really have anything to add to his take. As Randy Jackson often said on American Idol, he done sung it, dog. I'll just say one more thing, sorry. And this is from Stephen Sondheim in Sunday in the Park with George, which every podcaster should see in their lifetime. Anything you do, let it come from you, and then it will be new. And number 3, don't ignore the denominator. One last comment about the true crime stats from Edison's batting average chart. The number of shows from the genre in the top 200 is fairly high, 27. That's the numerator. But the denominator, which in this case, what EPM tracks, is 700, and that is not a very high number. One of these 2 things must be true, and they're both worth keeping in mind for the creator. Number 1, that 700 is wildly smaller than the actual universe of true crime shows, which throws this entire batting average calculation into even more doubt. Or number 2, that 700 is not that much smaller than the actual universe, which means that there really aren't that many attempts at true crime podcasts. And for that, I asked my friend Dan Meisner from Bumper, we'll link to them in the show notes, he who knows these things. And I asked him to give me the total number of true crime shows that are currently in Apple Podcasts. I'll leave the public sharing of that data to him. But I can tell you that while it is certainly a lot more than 700, it actually wasn't as high as I thought it would be. Society and Culture, for example, has about 13 times more shows in the Apple directory than does True Crime. Now, some of that is an artifact of the Apple taxonomy, which I think any of us who have been in podcasting for a decent length of time would agree is not as granular or satisfying as it could be. There are a lot of shows in Society and Culture, for example, that a listener would actually perceive as true crime. But to close out this article by throttling the last ounce of life out of baseball analogies, a true crime podcast is a particularly difficult fastball to hit. Here's what you need to produce a podcast about sports. Number 1, mouth. That's the list. Here is what you need to produce a true crime podcast. Number 1, narrative chops. Number 2, editing chops. Number 3, sound design chops. Number 4, research chops. And number 5, an actual murder. It's really hard to make a good true crime podcast, which is why there aren't even that many attempts. And surely that's a more salient aspect of the genre's high batting average. So a couple of final thoughts about all of this. Number 1, make sure that research about a thing actually measures that thing and not some other thing. Number 2, make a podcast that makes you happy, regardless of genre. Number 3, make it better every day. Number 4, don't murder anyone to make a podcast. And finally, don't murder anyone. Period. It looks bad. So let's wrap things up. Sounds Profitable is committed to lifting the entire podcast industry up every single day so that podcasters, perhaps like you, can build careers, companies can be founded, and great art can be created in this medium that we love so much. Part of that is understanding the data that we have access to, holding the industry accountable to higher standards and reporting that data, and providing as much context as we can about how to use that data to your advantage. We have some exciting initiatives currently in development to elevate the quality and quantity of useful data that podcasters have access to, which we'll be talking about on this show and in our newsletter very soon. But until then, why not subscribe to our new weekly short video series, Data Decoded? Each week, I break down one new piece of data in the podcast space in about 5 minutes, and how you can use it to level up your company or your own personal workflow. Now, I hate being on camera, so do not make me do this for nothing, people. Subscribe to Data Decoded, and we'll have the link in the show notes. Thanks again for the gift of your time and attention. And if you found this useful, be sure and subscribe to Sounds Profitable if you haven't already at soundsprofitable.com. Forward this to a friend or colleague. And don't forget our fleet of podcasts, not just this one, available in your podcast client of choice. Thanks again for listening to this show, How to Murder a Podcast. This episode was built using Spooler and hosted on Art19. I'm Tom Webster. Thanks for listening.